They lived in silence, and they died in silence. No obituary marked their passing. The house they inhabited was torn down before anyone thought to ask questions, and the village preferred forgetting over remembering. Yet their names are still etched in a parish book, their birth and death recorded with the same ink, as if God himself had pressed the nib down harder when it came to them. No one outside the family was ever permitted to enter that house. Even neighbors swore that curtains never moved, that the windows never opened, that light rarely passed through the glass. And though every settlement in that county kept its gossip, with this family there was only avoidance. They weren't spoken of. It was easier that way. The archives, however, do not forget. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. In the summer of 1834, in a small farming hamlet tucked against the river's bend, two siblings were born under the roof of the same parents. This was not unusual, for families often had many children, and births followed births in rapid succession. But these two remained tethered to one another in a manner that unsettled even their kin. Parish records from that year show their names entered together, with no space between them, as though the clerk refused to list one without the other. The family name was Calloway. Their father, Isaac Calloway, had inherited the land from a grandfather whose own line was shadowed by oddities. Children who did not survive past infancy, cousins who seemed afflicted with both frailty and uncanny resemblance. Their mother, Eliza, came from a neighboring family, and it was whispered even then that her marriage was meant not for expansion of bloodlines, but for their preservation. From their earliest days, the twins John and Miriam were kept apart from other children. They did not attend school, though their father could write and their mother could read. They were instructed only within the home, where lessons blurred between scripture and something less clear, less holy. A surviving fragment of a journal kept by their uncle, who lived on the far side of the property, makes an observation worth noting. I believe they are raising them inwards, not outwards. The children speak in half words, only the other completes. When they take meals, one will not chew until the other has swallowed. Isaac forbids questions. He says it is a matter of strength, of keeping blood from dilution. I find myself disturbed. It was the year 1847 when the first outsider set foot in the Calloway home. The county physician, summoned under the pretense of a fever, recorded in his ledger a single cryptic line: "What has been joined must never be joined again." He refused to return, and when pressed by town officials, he excused himself with the claim that the land was too far from his route. But his handwriting in other cases is firm. In theirs it trembles. The strangeness of John and Miriam only deepened as they grew. Witnesses described them as pale, their voices nearly identical, their movements mirror-like. When John raised his hand to gesture, Miriam's hand would lift in the same arc, though she did not appear to notice she was imitating him. When Miriam fell ill with a cough, John coughed too, though he had no fever. By the late 1850s, their parents had withdrawn entirely from the social fabric of the county. Harvest feasts, weddings, even funerals were attended by everyone but the Calloways. Rumor hardened into silence, and silence hardened into absence. The family was seen only as figures moving through the fields at dusk, or shapes glimpsed through shuttered glass. In 1862, Isaac Calloway died. The cause of death is unrecorded, though the parish register notes his burial was private and without assembly. Eliza followed only 2 years later, her final illness attributed vaguely to nervous decline. With both parents gone, the property passed to John and Miriam. By then they were nearly 30, and though by every social measure they should have sought spouses, none were forthcoming. It is here that the archive grows darker. A letter written by a distant cousin, found decades later in a locked drawer, testifies, "I rode past their fields in the autumn, and I swear upon the Lord that I saw John walking hand in hand with Miriam as no brother and sister should. She leaned against him as a wife might, and though they saw me, they did not release their hold. I was struck with such dread that I did not stop at the house, and I pray I never shall again." This letter was never delivered. Instead, it remained sealed in the cousin's writing desk until his death, where it was discovered by heirs who refused to speak of it. The years that followed left no marriage record for either John or Miriam, yet the census of 1870 lists them as household of 2, no dependent. But one line further down, a census taker scratched out what may have been the word infant. The ink bled through the paper as if it had been scrubbed furiously. What remained of the Calloway house fell into ruin after the roof collapsed. The fields were overrun, and the property was sold to another family who found it uninhabitable. Stones from the chimney were hauled off to repair walls elsewhere. Wood from the floorboards was burned for fire and the ground beneath was left untilled for decades. Yet beneath that ground, evidence persisted. When the parish cemetery was surveyed in 1909, it was noted that 2 graves stood apart from the others, without headstones but enclosed by a low iron fence. The record keeper identified them only as J. Calloway and Calloway, buried within days of one another in 8. No cause of death was listed, no mourners were recorded, but the silence around them, so total, so deliberate, speaks louder than any epitaph could. The Calloway graves stand without inscription, and yet it is from the margins of their history that fragments still rise. It is never the grand records that preserve what matters, it is the stray letter, the doctor's aside, the stain in a ledger. To look closely at these scraps is to feel the edges of something meant to stay hidden. By the winter of 1865, whispers about John and Miriam had hardened into what the community called a curse. Farmers who rented land nearby said the pair rarely spoke aloud, yet when they did, their sentences ended precisely as the other began. A diary kept by a traveling preacher who visited their parish that year preserves a moment of disquiet. I saw them seated in the pew. They had taken the place of their parents, side by side. The woman's head bent until her hair touched her brother's sleeve. They bowed together, rose together, knelt together, and when I turned to bless the congregation, I found their eyes fixed on me in such a way that I lost the words of prayer. There was no malice in it, yet I felt as though I had been studied. It is a small entry, yet it reveals how the Calloways were perceived, less as sinners than as a phenomenon. In 1867, the county registrar updated his file. Here too something strikes the reader. Beneath John's name and Miriam's, a column left for household relation is filled not with brother and sister but with a single dash, as though whoever wrote it could not decide or dared not write the truth. Neighbors reported sounds at night, a woman's cries followed by long intervals of silence, then the low murmur of a man's voice. More curious still, some claimed to hear the cry of a child, yet no baptism was ever recorded, no birth entered into the parish. One such neighbor, a widow named Catherine Hurst, wrote in a letter to her cousin in 1871, "You ask why I have stopped walking past the Calloway land. I tell you truly, it is not the sight of them, for I rarely see them, it is the noise. I heard it one autumn evening when the wind carried from their house. The cry was not like any child I have known, it was thinner, stretched, like the sound of a cat in a sack, and then all at once it stopped. Nothing more followed, not even This letter survived only because it was kept folded into a prayer book, forgotten on a shelf until decades later. The suggestion of children concealed, unnamed, perhaps lost, lingers in every source. The census marks, the erased ink, the half-heard cry, and yet as if bound by pact, the village refused to interfere. In that era, families were left to their secrets, so long as those secrets did not spill into the street. Still, the Calloways were not entirely unseen. In the early 1870s, a physician newly arrived from the city was called to their home. His surviving notes are brief, but what he observed hints at more. Patient, female, age 37, skin pale, tongue coated, abdomen slightly distended. Patient's brother attended throughout, would not leave the room. When I asked of household, no answer given. Patient's eyes followed mine too closely. She seemed to know what I was to ask before I had asked it. Treatment refused. He signed his name at the bottom but did not charge a fee. That in itself is unusual. One suspects he wanted no record of having profited from the Calloways' condition. By 1874, John and Miriam rarely attended parish. Their fields had grown neglected, the fences broken, yet they somehow sustained themselves. No accounts mention hired hands, nor were debts filed. It was as if the land gave back only to them, or they required less than others to survive. The most chilling record from this period lies not in letters or diaries, but in the county coroner's book. In 1876, an entry reads, "Unmarked infant corpse, found at river's edge, downstream of Calloway land, sex indeterminate, eyes clouded, limbs underformed, body interred in pauper's ground, source uncertain. No accusation was written, the body was buried without ceremony." Yet the timing, the location, and the silence that followed leave little doubt in the minds of later readers. It is tempting perhaps to dismiss all of this as rumor, exaggeration born of suspicion. But when placed together, the erased census, the physician's trembling note, the widow's haunted letter, a pattern emerges. It is not mere gossip, it is testimony scattered across decades, converging on the same conclusion. The Calloways were not brother and sister in the ordinary sense of the word. They had become something else to one another, and the community, whether through fear or exhaustion, allowed. The collapse began, fittingly, in 1881. That year, Winter came early and heavy, and by spring the parish register notes 2 burials: John Calloway, aged 47, and Miriam Calloway, aged 47, their graves, side by side, fenced off from the others, cause of death not stated, no mourners listed. It might have ended there, with 2 names fading into the soil, but the silence surrounding their deaths left behind more than questions. It left behind a hollow, an unfinished sentence, into which other voices began to speak. When the house finally fell into ruin, children dared each other to climb its beams. Some swore they found scraps of clothing in the floorboards, no larger than what would fit a doll. Others claimed to hear whispers when the wind passed through the chimney stone. Even decades later, when the last remnants of the foundation were cleared, workers reported a smell rising from the earth, not rot, not damp, but something sharp, metallic, clinging to the back of the throat. And always, the graves were 2 plots, iron-fenced, left untouched when the rest of the cemetery grew. What happened within that house is known only in pieces, and perhaps that is how the family intended it. But each fragment brings us closer to seeing the outline of the truth, that John and Miriam Calloway carried forward a union begun in secrecy, sanctioned by blood, and guarded until death. And if the past can leave such marks in parish books and coroner's notes, then perhaps the earth itself remembers more than it lets on. It is in the aftermath of John and Miriam's passing that the most curious documents begin to appear. While they lived, the Calloways left few records beyond those scattered notes of physicians and neighbors. In death, however, their absence invited scrutiny. Men with ledgers and lanterns entered their house, cataloging what remained. What they found was both sparse and strange. The house itself was in disrepair, windows shuttered for decades, hearth cold and clogged with ash, floors marked with a soot that no broom could remove. And yet within that desolation were signs of order. On a small desk in the upper chamber lay dozens of slips of paper, each covered in a tight, spidery hand. They were not letters, nor sermons, nor accounts. They were numbers, columns of figures, written and rewritten, divided into pairs, circled and struck through. A local solicitor, who assisted in the clearing, wrote, "It seemed as if the Calloways had for years been engaged in some arithmetic of their own devising. I could make nothing of it save that the same numbers recurred, 2, 4, 6, always in sequence, and occasionally marked with the word issue. There was a sense of ledgering something not financial but biological. These scraps were gathered into a folio. Now only his description survives. Beside the papers, they found small boxes lined with cloth. Within one lay strands of dark hair, bound in ribbon. Another held fragments of teeth, too small to belong to adults. No parish baptism recorded them. No burial marked their resting place. In 1882, the county physician was invited to examine these remains. His notes, though couched in the language of medicine, carry the weight of unease. Specimens examined suggest repeated terminations, or losses of offspring, dentition incomplete, enamel irregular, root development absent. Though one cannot prove maternity, circumstantial evidence points to Miss Calloway, whether due to close consanguinity or some other hereditary weakness. These offspring appear unfit for survival. The conclusion is morbid, but consistent. The term consanguinity, so clinical on paper, was whispered more darkly among neighbors. To them it was not science but curse, a punishment that the land itself had visited upon the siblings for their trespass. Yet the medical men were not content to leave it there. In 1884, an article appeared in a provincial journal, unsigned, titled "Notes on the Effects of Consanguineous Union." Though the Calloways were not named, the details are unmistakable. The writer describes a family in the southern counties, where repeated unions between first-degree kindred produced malformations incompatible with longevity. He goes further. The pair, though of sound constitution themselves, produced only weak or distorted-ish. The record is not public, but its study may aid in understanding hereditary defect. It is chilling to think of John and Miriam's private grief. Whatever children came and vanished, reduced to data in a physician's experiment. And yet this is how their story began to leak beyond the village, transformed into evidence for men who wished to prove theories of degeneration.
Meanwhile, among those who had known them, memory took a different shape. A woman named Ruth Taylor, who as a girl had been sent to bring bread to the Calloways, recalled decades later, "They were not unkind. My mother sent me to them for charity's sake, thinking they had no means of their own. When I gave the bread, the woman touched my hand, and it was cold, though the fire was lit. She looked at me as if she would speak, but the man answered for her. He said, 'We have all we need.
When I told my mother, she bade me never go again. That last phrase, "we have all we need," echoes through each account. A simple statement, but one that conceals more than it reveals. Did they mean one another? Did they mean the arithmetic on the slips of paper, the hair and teeth preserved in boxes, the quiet covenant that bound them apart from the rest of the world? By 1886, when surveyors mapped the parish for taxation, they noted the Callaway land as unproductive, and yet no foreclosure was filed, no auction advertised. The land remained in the family's name, as though the dead still paid its dues. Some whispered that kin from a distant branch had taken charge, but no signature ever appeared. It was as if the soil itself resisted erasure, holding fast to the names John and Miriam. The silence might have endured, were it not for the journals of a physician named Dr. Whitcomb, who visited the area in the 1890s while studying cases of hereditary madness. Among his papers, rediscovered in 1912, is an account titled simply "The Callaway Line." In it he claims to have interviewed several villagers, collecting their memories of the siblings. He writes, "It is the impression of many that the Callaways left issue, though none was seen to maturity. Rumor persists of a child hidden, not buried, whose presence was felt though not admitted. Some speak of a face glimpsed at the upper window after both parents had died. These are dismissed as fancies, yet in every telling the detail recurs, a pale countenance watching from shadow. Whether this child truly existed, or whether memory and fear conspired to invent it, cannot be proven, but the consistency of the tale passed from mouth to mouth, decade after decade, suggests that something lingered in that house longer than John and Miriam themselves. By the turn of the century, the ruins of the Callaway home had become a place of avoidance. No farmer would graze cattle there, no woodcutter took its beams, the cemetery plots remained fenced and untouched, though the rest of the ground grew over with wheat. Travelers remarked on the silence of the place, the way sound seemed to fall flat as one approached. In 1903, a folklorist collecting rural legends recorded a tale of the brother-sister bride and groom said to haunt their land. In the story, they appear at dusk standing together in the field, their faces indistinguishable in the half-light, their hands joined as if in vow. It is only when one comes close that the figures are seen to fade, leaving only the smell of iron in the air. Thus the Callaways passed from history into legend, yet even in legend, the details of their life remain sharp, the arithmetic of their papers, the bones of their children, the silence of their graves. What remains unclear, what perhaps will never be clear, is whether they considered themselves cursed, or whether they embraced their union as necessity, as fate. The scraps do not answer, they only circle back like the numbers on those slips, repeating the same unfinished sequence, 2, 4, 6, and in every repetition, the unspoken word beneath issue. By the first years of the 20th century, the Callaway story had already slipped into the realm of folklore. Yet folklore has a curious way of drawing the attention of those who seek evidence. It was not only villagers who repeated the tale, but students of heredity, archivists of abnormality, and even a handful of spiritualists, who believed that the Callaway land held impressions of a trauma too heavy to disperse. The first to treat it with scientific seriousness was Arthur Whitcomb, the same physician who had noted whispers of a child glimpsed in the upper windows. In 1907, he presented a lecture at the London Society for Psychical and Hereditary Research. His subject, an example of latent consanguinity in rural England. The Callaway name does not appear in his notes, but in every other respect the description is exact. Whitcomb claimed to have uncovered corroborative traces of offspring beyond the fragments already known. He cited a midwife's anonymous testimony, summoned once, in secrecy, by the woman. "I found her in travail. The man stood beside her, pale but firm. The child came weak, did not cry, and was gone before dawn. They bade me swear never to speak. I held my oath until both were buried." This testimony, if genuine, confirms what had been suspected, that the Callaways bore more children than were ever baptized or buried. Each, it seems, was short. Whitcomb argued that their case exemplified the dangers of inbreeding, useful for those campaigning against what was termed consanguineous degeneration. Yet he lingered too long on the detail of secrecy, as if drawn less to the science than to the Gothic atmosphere of concealment. Not everyone agreed with his conclusions. A year later, in 1908, a rebuttal appeared in the Journal of Eugenic Inquiry.
Its anonymous author dismissed Whitcomb's evidence as anecdote, warning against the sensationalism of turning rural tragedies into carnival exhibits. Still, the article acknowledged the peculiar fascination of the unnamed case. Meanwhile, villagers clung to their own version. For them, the Calloways were not data, but omen. Oral accounts from the period describe farmers refusing to buy stock that grazed too near the Callaway field. A diary from 1910 kept by a local schoolmaster notes, "Children say if you stand at their gate at sundown, you hear counting 2, 4, 6, always even numbers, spoken low, as though recited by lips no longer living." It is impossible to know whether the schoolmaster believed the children, but his inclusion of the detail shows how deeply the imagery of numbers had entered the local imagination. The arithmetic found on John and Miriam's slips of paper had become in folklore a chant echoing from the grave. By 1912, the old house had collapsed, leaving only a chimney stack and the remnants of the desk where those slips once lay, yet visitors claimed that the ruin remained inhabited. In one account, a vicar's assistant who passed the site at dusk reported, "2 figures stood as if waiting. I thought them travelers and offered greeting, but neither replied. When I looked again they had vanished into the mist." Such stories, while unverifiable, multiplied as the physical evidence of the Calloways' lives disappeared. It is a pattern common to history's darker corners. As the documents burn and the bones decay, the legend grows stronger. During the First World War, the story merely vanished under the weight of greater horrors. Yet in 1921, when the parish compiled its memorial for the fallen, an odd discovery was made. The clerk, tasked with updating burial registers, noted an entry in faded ink, "Infant of J&M Callaway." No date, no burial, no such line had been seen before. Where it came from, none could say. The page itself appeared older than the war, perhaps older than the century, but it had gone unnoticed until then. The clerk, unsettled, added a note in the margin, "Unclear whether error or apparition." His words reflect both bureaucratic frustration and the sense that the Calloways continued to haunt the very records meant to erase them. In the 1930s, when eugenic theories reached their grim zenith, the Callaway case resurfaced once more. A scholar named Edmund Firth cited it in his book The Burden of Heredity, though again without naming the family. He described a brother and sister, joined as man and wife, who produced no viable line, their blood extinguished by the very act of union. His tone was clinical, yet his choice of words "extinguished" betrays a fascination bordering on poetry. By then, the Calloways were no longer remembered in the village as living persons. They had become archetypes, invoked to frighten children from wandering at night or to explain sickness with no other cause. "Don't drink from that stream," mothers warned, "else you'll catch the Callaway blight." To invoke their name was to invoke misfortune. Yet beneath the legend, traces of humanity linger. In 1939, an evacuee billeted in the parish wrote to her family in London, "There is an old place here, all in ruins, where they say a brother and sister lived as man and wife. The children at school make games of it, daring one another to run across the field at dusk, but I went there alone, and found it sad rather than frightening. There were stones set in a circle, as if once marking graves. I felt pity for them more than fear." Pity, that rarest of responses in the long history of the Callaway story. The Second World War scattered the parish archives, and many were lost in the Blitz. Among the missing were several files connected to the Calloways. Whether those files held proof of the hidden child, or merely repeated the same rumors, we cannot know. Their absence ensures that speculation will always outrun evidence. By mid-century, scholars debated whether the case had ever existed at all. Was it merely a parable of degeneration, invented to justify social fears, or had two siblings truly lived, secluded and bound to one another, leaving behind a paper trail of numbers and fragments of bone? The ruins themselves provided no answer. By 1950, the chimney had collapsed, and the field was plowed for the first time in half a century. Yet even then, the farmer who attempted the task stopped after a single season, claiming the soil yielded nothing but stone and sorrow. He left it fallow thereafter, and so it remained. In this way, the Calloways slipped further into that strange category of history, where the border with myth dissolves, and yet every few decades, a scrap reappears, a testimony, a register entry, a journal hinting that the line between record and legend is thinner than we think. What remains constant across each retelling is the unsettling arithmetic: children that were never baptized, fragments preserved without explanation, numbers circling without resolution, always the sequence, always the word ish, and in that unfinished sum lies the core of the Calloway mystery, not merely that a brother and sister bound themselves in a union forbidden, but that they sought desperately, obsessively, to count what could not be counted, the brief, flickering lives of children who left no trace but a whisper in the ledger. The decades after the war produced a silence around the Calloway name, yet silence is not absence, it is a kind of preservation. Those who returned to the parish after 1945 found the field untouched, the hedgerows grown high, the ruins buried under nettles. The Calloways, though long gone, remained as a caution unspoken. Farmers avoided the soil, children used the site as a dare, and elders changed subject when asked directly. Then in 1957, something surfaced, a team of council workers, widening a rural road, disturbed ground near the old Calloway property. What they uncovered was not treasure, nor relics, but a shallow deposit of bones, small bones, infant bones. The workers, uncertain whether they had stumbled upon some forgotten burial ground, alerted local authority. The remains were collected, tagged, and quietly transported to the county coroner. The coroner's report is chilling in its understatement. 4 partial skeletons, all consistent with infants less than 1 year of age, bones fragile, degraded, no evidence of coffin or funerary practice, deposited shallow, likely without ceremony, cause of death indeterminate. Nowhere in the report do the words Calloway or incest appear, yet the location was unmistakable. Old villagers whispered at the truth, long whispered and doubted, had at last broken through the soil. 4 infants, unnamed, buried shallow like refuse rather than kin. The discovery never made newspapers. Records suggest the coroner himself advised discretion, fearing sensational coverage. The bones were reburied in the parish cemetery under a simple marker, unknown children. No ceremony accompanied the act, and the files themselves were sealed, though copies exist in private hands. But secrets cannot be interred so easily. In 1962, an amateur historian named Margaret Keane, researching local genealogy, stumbled across references to the sealed file. Keane was relentless. She began interviewing elderly residents, collecting fragments of oral memory, before they vanished. One testimony, given by a woman of 86, resonates with eerie clarity. I was but a girl when folks said you could see lights in the Calloway house, 2 figures moving by candle, though no fire was kept in the hearth. My own father told me never to look too long, he said. What they do in there is not for our eyes. After they died, my mother told me there were babes, never named, never christened. She said the earth would not keep them down. Keane published her findings in a limited-run booklet, The Calloway Mystery, A Parish Remembered. Most copies vanished into libraries or were bought by collectors of the macabre, but her work revived scholarly interest. For the first time in half a century, the Calloways were spoken of not just as ghost story, but as case study. In her booklet, Keane proposed a disturbing theory, that the Calloways may not have been entirely abandoned by their neighbors. Her research uncovered old account books, suggesting trades of grain, milk and even medical herbs with the pair on the lane. If true, it means villagers both condemned and enabled them, sustaining their secret life even as they whispered about it in fear. This theory infuriated. Letters to the local paper accused Keane of slandering the parish dead, of resurrecting scandal best forgotten. One man wrote bitterly, "We buried those children once, do not dig them up again." Yet others admitted relief, as if the telling of the story gave form to unease too long carried in silence. By the late 1960s, the Calloways had become a subject of hushed fascination in university circles. Psychologists cited them when discussing the pathology of isolation. Geneticists invoked them as a dire parable of recessive inheritance. Anthropologists treated them as an English echo of ancient taboos. In each field, the Calloways were less a family than a symbol, but it was in 1973 that the story took its darkest archival turn. Renovations at the county records office uncovered a box mislabeled Agricultural Yields, 1850, 1870. Inside were scraps of paper in an unfamiliar hand. At first glance, they seemed harmless. Numbers, tallies, repetitions of even figures, but further inspection revealed something else. Phrases scrawled in the margins. No breath, weighed too light, no cry. Though unsigned, the papers bore the same obsessive arithmetic attributed to John Calloway. Margins filled with sums, 2, 4, 6, 8,
paired with fragments that suggest the fate of infants delivered only to perish. Archivists were shaken. One described the notes as an account ledger of lives never lived. Scholars argued whether the papers were authentic or forgery, yet the ink analysis suggested mid-19th century origin, aligning with the Callaways' life. If genuine, they are perhaps the closest we will ever come to the couple's own voice, a desperate clinical catalogue of loss. The discovery reignited interest in the parish itself. Visitors began arriving, walking the old field, leaving offerings on the unmarked grave of the unknown children. Some left flowers, others toys, as though mourning strangers whose existence was denied them a century earlier. The parish council, embarrassed, removed the items, but they always returned.
Meanwhile, a new generation of villagers grew weary of the story. They complained that their home was becoming synonymous with incest and grave scandal. "We are not the Callaways," one letter insisted, "and we should not bear their curse." Yet folklore is indifferent to protest. The Callaways had already outlived their time, their story stitched into the soil. By the 1980s, paranormal enthusiasts joined the scholars. Reports circulated of voices heard in the field at night, soft counting, always in even numbers. Visitors spoke of sudden chills or of hearing an infant's cry cut short by silence. One investigator claimed to record a whisper on tape, a single word drawn out, almost a sigh issue. Skeptics dismissed these as hoaxes, the predictable outcome of expectation and suggestion. Yet the persistence of the reports mirrors the persistence of the Callaway name itself. Where evidence falters, imagination rushes in. Today, the site is barely marked on maps. A cluster of nettles, a sunken patch of soil, the faint outline of stones that may once have bordered graves. And yet standing there, one cannot help but sense the accumulated weight of retellings, from Whitcomb's lecture to Keene's booklet, from the coroner's sealed files to the scraps of arithmetic pulled from mislabeled boxes. Together they form not a full history but something darker, a palimpsest of secrecy, loss, and obsession. The Callaways, through silence and revelation alike, remain half seen, half proven. Their story, like their children, refuses to rest. And so the arithmetic continues, stretching from the 19th century into our own. 2, 4, 6, 8, the rhythm of absence, the counting of ghosts. By the early 1990s, the Callaway story had slipped beyond the parish. Scholars cited it in textbooks, journalists hinted at it in long-form essays, and inevitably it crossed into television. A 1994 documentary aired on late-night BBC under the title Taboo Bloodlines, Britain's Hidden History. Among segments on intermarriage, cousin unions, and hereditary disease, a 20-minute portion was dedicated solely to the couple who shared parents. The program was cautious, though its imagery was not. It panned across the field where the Callaway cottage had once stood, lingered on the parish cemetery's unknown children marker, and overlaid whispered accounts from villagers now in their 90s. One elderly man, filmed in shadow, admitted, "My father told me never to walk that lane, never to look upon them if they were seen. He said to watch was to be watched in return." Viewers wrote letters, half horrified, half skeptical. Some accused the program of fabricating evidence, exploiting rural gossip for ratings, but others confessed the story unsettled them precisely because it had not been sensationalized. Its power lay in its restraint, the suggestion of children buried without christening, of numbers scrawled in ledgers, of a family remembered mostly in silence. In the wake of the broadcast, a new audience emerged. Descendant genealogical societies reported a surge of inquiries from those bearing the Callaway name, anxious to know whether they were connected to the couple. Some sought to disprove lineage, others to confirm. In one case, a man from Kent confessed in an interview, "Part of me hopes I'm tied to them, not for pride, but for the weight of it, the idea that such a story flows in my blood." But not all descendants were willing to be studied. When academics reached out with offers of genetic testing, many refused outright. "Our blood is our own," one letter replied curtly. Another warned, "You may find what you are not prepared to carry." It was during this genealogical fervor that a troubling set of records surfaced from the county asylum archives, previously overlooked due to misfiling. The papers included intake notes from 1874, the year following the deaths of John and Mary Callaway. Two women, admitted under different surnames, were described as fragile, unable to sleep, repeating phrases about the children under soil, Their ages aligned with that of women in the neighboring hamlets. Some researchers argue they were neighbors traumatized by what they had witnessed. Others whisper a different possibility, that the Callaway's children survivors were quietly committed, hidden under assumed names to avoid scandal. The theory remains unproven, but the documents themselves carry a weight difficult to dismiss. Margins contain frantic scribbles from attendants. She rocks as though cradling. She says she hears breath at her shoulder. She repeats, weigh them, without ceasing. If these were indeed Callaway offspring, then the story does not end with shallow grave. It extends into wards, into padded rooms, where memory itself became the punishment. By the late 1990s, the Callaways had become a subject not merely of folklore but of ethics. Universities debated whether further excavation of the site was warranted. Archaeologists argued that confirming additional burials would bring closure. Local leaders countered that digging would desecrate ground already heavy with grief. The debate reached national papers, sparking letters from clergy, academics, and even descendants who demanded to be left in peace. Amid this, strange reports persisted. In 1998, a night watchman stationed near the old parish road recorded an incident in his log. Heard faint infant crying, though no houses nearby. Investigated, nothing found. Later, counted whisper of numbers carried on wind. Uneasy, though dismissed by his employers, the log entry remains preserved. Another fragment in the long chain of testimonies. In the early 2000s, technology added a new layer. Digital forums circulated the Callaway legend, pairing grainy photos of the field with transcriptions of Keene's booklet. Enthusiasts debated whether the arithmetic notes represented confession, ritual, or delusion. Some even attempted numerical ciphers, claiming to reveal hidden messages. One theory argued that each number aligned with lunar cycles, suggesting the couple timed births and burials to phases of the moon. Others countered that the sums were nothing more than obsession, a grief that calcified into mathematics. Yet the fascination only deepened. Paranormal investigators carried cameras into the field, producing videos rife with static, muffled cries, and inexplicable cold spots. These circulated widely online, further entwining the Callaways with modern ghost lore. For villagers, the attention was unbearable. They removed signage, lobbied against tours, and even attempted to rename the lane that once led to the Callaway cottage. Still, seekers arrived, some leaving coins or children's toys, others carving numbers into fence posts. The land, once avoided, became a magnet for the curious, the grieving, and the thrill-seeking alike. But beneath the modern noise, the archival voice remains strongest. A 2007 academic paper revisited the asylum files, concluding with a chilling line: the Callaway case represents less a family than a wound, a hereditary lesion etched into communal memory. Its gravity lies not in confirmation, but in the refusal of silence to hold. Even now, questions multiply. How many children were born in that cottage? How many buried unnamed? Were survivors hidden in institutions, their bloodlines obscured by deliberate renaming? Did the arithmetic serve as confession, or as a way to strip humanity into numbers, reducing grief to manageable sums? We will likely never know, and perhaps that uncertainty is its own form of inheritance, the passing down of a story unresolved, haunting precisely because it will not resolve. The Callaways may be gone a century and a half, their bones scattered, their cottage erased, but through ledgers, through sealed files, through whispers recorded in parish registers and asylum notes, they always returning, like the even count that threads their memory. 2, 4, 6, 8. An echo not of life, but of what life left behind. By 2010, the Callaway case had crossed yet another threshold. It was no longer just a matter for historians and folklorists, but for scientists. A consortium at Cambridge, funded through a quiet grant, began investigating the genetic legacy of the parish. Their goal was framed delicately: an inquiry into hereditary markers in isolated populations. But everyone understood the subtext. They were looking for the Callaways in the blood. The research was discreet, and initially, participants were willing, elderly villagers, some carrying family names that had persisted for centuries, submitted cheek swabs and genealogical notes. The results, however, unsettled even the researchers. Patterns emerged, recessive traits clustering oddly,
rare blood disorders appearing in statistical concentrations far higher than the national average. One report noted an unusual frequency of heterochromia, children born with eyes of two different colors. Another recorded instances of siblings who bore uncanny resemblance, closer than typical kinship would allow. The findings stopped short of declaring Calloway inheritance, but in private, several of the researchers admitted what they feared, that the family's shadow still lingers in flesh. Ethical lines blurred. Should such findings be published? Would it condemn innocent families to stigma? The internal debate grew fierce, and by 2012 the project was quietly suspended. The results sealed in university archives. Only fragments leaked, whispered by students who had glimpsed charts, pinned to departmental boards, ratios of 2:1:4. Online forums spoke of the even count, turning it into shorthand for cursed family lines. Amateur investigators uploaded maps of the parish marked with symbols, claiming burial mounds beneath the soil. A crude digital game circulated, tasking players with weighing pixelated infants and entering sums to progress to the next level. It was tasteless, but it showed how deeply the story had lodged into the cultural bloodstream. Meanwhile, physical evidence refused to stay buried. In 2013, after a season of heavy rains, soil shifted near the edge of the old parish cemetery. A small excavation was ordered. Under the guise of maintenance, what emerged unsettled even hardened workers. A cluster of bones, tiny and incomplete, bundled together without coffin. Parish officials claimed they were remnants of earlier centuries, displaced by erosion, yet the alignment carefully paired, 2 by 2, rekindled whispers of the Calloways. The bones were catalogued, boxed, and sent to county storage. No press release followed, no public notice, but an employee who handled the remains later described a strange sensation. It felt less like holding bones, and more like holding silence, as though the air thickened when you lifted them. By 2015, attention shifted toward the asylum records once more. Digitization made them accessible to a wider audience, and with access came scrutiny. A graduate student uncovered a series of overlooked annotations in the margins of a physician's logbook. Scrawled in faded ink were notations beside certain female patients. Mouth scarred, suggest biting self, voice low, sings when alone, hymn fragment, and most disturbing, claims to have counted 13 children buried. If authentic, these notes implied direct testimony from survivors, perhaps daughters of John and Mary, perhaps nieces or kin absorbed into the household. The ambiguity was cruel, but the effect was undeniable. The Calloway history was not merely rumor, it was confession, preserved in institutional ink. The revelations reignited debate. Scholars of medical history argued that the asylum notes reflected hysteria, delusion, or confabulation. Folklorists insisted the consistencies pointed to truth. Descendants again bristled at their family names surfacing in headlines. One wrote to a newspaper in exasperation, "The Calloways are gone, stop resurrecting them. Some of us live with these names still, and with them the shame." Yet silence has never lasted long around the Calloways. Each time the story is buried, it resurfaces like the bones after rain, like the numbers scribbled in margins. By the late 2010s, attention turned once more to the land. A proposal surfaced to redevelop part of the parish field for housing. Villagers resisted fiercely, citing both heritage and haunting. At town meetings, elders warned against disturbing the soil. One man was reported to have stood trembling before the council, declaring, "They're not finished." Every spade turned is an invitation. The development was eventually abandoned, leaving the ground to grass and silence once more. But silence is deceptive. Those who walk the lane at dusk still report unease. Travelers speak of a faint rhythmic sound, like a scale tipping, like weight being measured. Some describe counting against their will, lips moving with numbers they did not mean to recite, always even numbers, always ending on 8. What remains constant through all eras, 1830s, 1870s, 1970s, and now the 2010s, is the arithmetic, not just the sums scrawled by the couple, but the recurrence of pairs of multiples, of balance and imbalance. It is as though the Calloway name itself has become an equation, repeating across generations in body, in soil, in memory. The case defies closure. It will not rest in ledgers, nor in documentaries, nor in archives. It resists finality, and perhaps that is why it continues to draw us back. Because what the Calloways began was not merely a family, but a pattern, one that has yet to end. And though the field lies quiet, though the cottage has long since fallen, there is a sense whispered in every account, written between every line. The counting has never stopped. By 2017, the legend of the Calloways had entered a sharper phase. What had been regarded as folklore or the eccentric obsession of scholars began colliding with modern tools, scanners, genetic software, and imaging technology. When the county archives approved the digital reproduction of the asylum ledgers, something unexpected occurred. High-resolution scans revealed faint indentations between lines of ink, impressions left by the pressure of a hand long gone. Using angled light, researchers discerned words that had not been visible to the naked eye. They were not physicians' notes, nor patient scribble. They appeared instead to be calculations, rows of figures pressed so faintly that even paper fibers barely held them. The numbers followed a grim rhythm. 2, 2. In margins beside the figures were small marks, crude symbols, circles bisected, pairs of dots. It was not the work of a distracted attendant. It was deliberate. Some suspected the Calloways themselves had handled these pages, pressing numbers into the paper during their confinement. The discovery reanimated the notion that their arithmetic was not just metaphor but obsession, ritualized, repeated, etched wherever surfaces allowed. What unsettled investigators further was the absence of odd numbers. The chain of doubling carried on with mechanical devotion to parity, to evenness, as if odd numbers had been rejected entirely from their logic.
It was around this time that new oral testimony emerged, passed down through a family that had quietly preserved its tale for generations. A woman in her 80s, reluctant yet compelled, described her grandfather's warning: never step between stones when they stand in pairs. It's their way through. It's how they return. Pressed for details, she faltered, but her phrasing carried weight. Stones in pairs, perhaps boundary markers, perhaps graves. Her grandfather had forbidden his children from playing in the old parish fields, claiming that stepping between the paired markers meant crossing into Callaway territory, a place not entirely confined to Earth. This fragment might have remained a curiosity, but it coincided with ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted on the same field in The scans revealed anomalies beneath the soil, disturbances in symmetrical pairs, shallow yet consistent, stretching in a line across the slope. Officially, they were dismissed as agricultural features. Unofficially, those who viewed the data remarked on the precision, not random but placed, not natural but chosen. The connection between arithmetic and land grew harder to ignore. One archaeologist suggested that the Calloways, or those who followed them, had inscribed their logic into the very ground: pairs of burials, pairs of stones, numbers doubling in both life and soil. It was less history than design. Around this point, the story began to fracture into camps. Skeptics, insisting that modern methods only magnified meaningless patterns, and believers, convinced the Callaway order was reasserting itself in the present. What united both sides, however, was unease. The closer one looked, the less the Callaways resembled a family, and the more they resembled an equation without an endpoint. One chilling account came from a technician who processed the radar scan. She claimed that during one late evening of analysis, she began hearing faint tapping in her office, steady, deliberate, 2 beats at a time. At first she dismissed it as pipes, as settling walls, but when she checked the waveform of the scan, she saw a repeating spike: 2, 2, 4, 4, 8, 8. It was like the data itself was knocking, she wrote in an email before requesting reassignment. The obsession spread further online. In obscure corners of the internet, forums circulated the scans overlaid with numeric sequences. Amateur numerologists linked the Callaway arithmetic to ancient doubling systems, to Pythagorean rituals, even to the binary logic of computers. Some dismissed these as opportunistic connections, yet the persistence of the sequence was undeniable. At the center of it all remained the same unyielding truth: what the Callaways had done was not isolated to their cottage. It had seeped outward into fields, into ledgers, into descendants' blood. Each generation discovered its traces anew, as though the family's story was less a past to remember and more a pattern to repeat. The most disturbing evidence, however, emerged in late 2019, when a descendant, anonymous, reluctant, tormented, submitted a personal account to a regional historical society. His words, redacted for privacy, contained a confession. I dream the numbers, always. They begin quietly like a child's chant, and they build until I wake gasping. When I trace my family tree, the lines fold back, doubling, cousins to siblings, siblings to spouses. I cannot tell where the branching stops. It is as if the Calloways are not behind us but within us, cycling again. The society did not publish the letter, but among archivists, it circulated as the most harrowing piece of testimony yet. If genuine, it suggested the arithmetic was not mere superstition but something lived, carried in memory and blood. By the close of the decade, the Calloway chapter no longer seemed like the tale of one couple. It had become something broader, an infection of logic, a hereditary ritual, a pattern that defied time. The numbers pressed into ledgers, the stones aligned in fields, the bones found in pairs, all pointed to a truth the parish had long whispered but never dared to say aloud. The Calloways had not vanished, they had multiplied, and as the 21st century advanced, what once seemed like history began to feel like prophecy. It was in early 2020, with the world already unsettled by other crises, that the Calloway story reached its most disquieting revelation. For years, genealogists had pieced together fragments of birth registries, baptismal entries, and scattered medical notes, but that spring, a complete parish register, long misfiled under an unrelated surname, was scanned in its entirety. What it contained dissolved the final veil of uncertainty. Across 6 consecutive entries, the priest's handwriting grew increasingly erratic. The ink faltered, letters twisted as though his hand shook. He recorded marriages not between distant cousins, but between siblings, pairs of names repeated with only slight variation in spelling, as though the family sought to confuse record keepers. One entry bore a marginal note in Latin, in duplici sanguine, in double blood. The meaning was unmistakable. The Calloways had not merely flirted with endogamy or secrecy, they had formalized unions between brother and sister, more than once. The registers showed witnesses, all surnamed Calloway, as though the family's audience and officiants were only themselves. This discovery explained the silence of the archives, the destroyed certificates, the sealed asylum files. What had been concealed was not madness alone but deliberate merging, a collapse of kinship boundaries into a closed loop. The wider implications were devastating. For generations, the Calloway bloodline had folded inward, reducing the tree to a tangle, producing children who were at once offspring, niece, nephew, cousin. Each generation grew less distinguishable, more recursive, until the family no longer resembled a branching lineage, but a circle. Medical historians who reviewed the records suggested that this would have produced physical and psychological anomalies, fragile bones, impaired immunity, seizures, and above all, obsessive, cognitive loop. It was not simply madness, they argued, but the byproduct of genetic convergence, thought patterns circling endlessly, just as the bloodlines had. But the true horror lay not in what had occurred, but in how thoroughly the family had normalized. Marginalia, in the priest's hand, suggested that when he objected, he was threatened. They said the union is holy in itself, not in law, he scrawled. His protests grew fainter with each entry, until finally the handwriting stopped. For the next several years, there were no more Calloway baptisms recorded at all. Silence swallowed their line, or at least its official trace. By the autumn of 2020, the revelation spread across scholarly circles, and eventually into local media. Yet every retelling seemed to trigger disturbances, emails corrupted with repeating numbers, hard drives failing after files containing the Calloway scans were opened, researchers reporting dreams of arithmetic that woke them drenched in sweat. A folklorist in Norfolk recounted how, after giving a lecture on the Calloways, she returned home to find her front garden subtly altered. The paving stones, once laid irregularly, now appeared in pairs. When she attempted to shift them back, she discovered the soil beneath had been disturbed, as though someone or something had been marking the ground while she spoke. What unsettled many was the timing. Each modern revelation coincided with recurrence. As the archives yielded secrets, patterns surfaced in the present. Pairs of graves exposed by erosion, twin storms battering the coast within the same week, livestock births yielding only stillborn twins. Skeptics scoffed at these as coincidences, yet those who traced Calloway history knew better. The family's law was repetition, doubling,
What had been initiated in secrecy was reasserting itself across centuries. The most chilling moment came from a hospital geneticist who quietly admitted under anonymity that she had sequenced the DNA of a man claiming Callaway disease. She refused to publish her findings, but confided to colleagues that the genome showed unusual homozygosity, alleles paired and paired again, far beyond normal expectations. It is as though the blood had been folded without end, The man himself reported a recurring experience. At night, lying half awake, he would hear a soft knock on the wall, always twice. When he opened his eyes, he would see shadows that did not separate, but moved in mirrored unison, as if two bodies occupied one form. By the close of the year, the story of the Callaways had become more than local lore. It had become an allegory of inheritance gone wrong, of secrecy collapsing into curse, and yet it was no longer safe to think of it as allegory alone. Too many witnesses, too many recurrences, too many numbers pressed into modern lives. The doubling was not historical, it was active, which is why when archivists began preparing the asylum ledger for public release in early 2021, many begged them to reconsider. To scan those pages and circulate them freely, they argued, was to risk replication. Arithmetic has no need of blood once it finds text. Once inscribed in digital form, the Callaway law could multiply beyond control. For if the Callaways had proven anything, it was this: once a pattern is set, it does not end, it repeats. And now their repetition had entered the present. It was inevitable that the asylum ledger would be digitized. In early 2021, despite warnings from archivists and folklorists alike, the volume was scanned and uploaded. Within days, researchers and casual readers began circulating the images. The entries were grotesquely meticulous: dietary records, anatomical sketches, and notes on behavioral doubling. One physician in 1834 had written of a Callaway patient, "She will not eat unless her brother eats the same morsel at the same moment. When offered food alone, she retches until he is summoned. Their breath, their pulse, their sleep synchron." Another entry described a child who could not distinguish his reflection. He attempted to converse with it, to feed it scraps, to pray beside it. The doctors interpreted this as delusion, but in the margins another hand had written, "Perhaps not delusion, perhaps law." The release of these documents did not clarify the Callaways' history so much as perpetuate it. Every reader, it seemed, carried away more than knowledge. People began to report auditory phenomena: 2 knocks on the wall at night, the sound of footsteps pacing in pairs. Screens froze not with random noise but with mirrored blocks, left and right halves of the same face. At first, these accounts were dismissed as hysteria, yet as the months passed, the disturbances grew harder to deny. Entire hard drives corrupted into duplication loops, folders nested within identical folders, file names reproducing themselves into infinity. In one case, a university archive reported that a server had duplicated a Callaway image more than 60,000 times in a single night, until the system collapsed. By mid-2021, a new unease had taken root among those who handled the material. It was whispered that the Callaway curse was never simply hereditary, it was mimetic, embedded in patterns of repetition themselves. Blood carried it, but so could writing, record-keeping, arithmetic. The more their story was documented, the more the story, and so the family's secrecy appeared, not as shame but as containment. Their silence was a barrier, however imperfect. Our revelation was their release. Even now in quiet English towns, archivists claim to see faint chalk marks appear on doors, 2 vertical lines, side by side. In Norfolk, a lecturer returned to her office to find all her books rearranged, not alphabetically but in pairs, and across message boards, late-night confessions appear from readers, who after learning the Callaway name, find themselves compelled to write it twice, as though once were insufficient. The most troubling are the descendants. Several living claimants, after interviews, ceased respond. Neighbors reported their curtains drawn in daylight, their gardens overgrown, their homes strangely silent except for the sound heard clearly through the walls of chairs being moved in symmetrical rhythm, always 2 at a time. The Callaways, it seems, are not God. Their pattern was never bound to blood alone. It has crossed into record, into rumor, into the recursive loops of our own machines, which leaves the final question unanswered. What did they serve? What compelled them to fold bloodlines until identity dissolved? The priests called it heresy, the doctors called it madness, the neighbors called it shame, but the Callaways themselves left only a phrase, scrawled across the inside cover of the asylum ledger: in duplices sanguine. The door remains open. No one knows what door they meant. Some suggest it was metaphor, a justification for their unnatural unions. Others fear it was literal, that repetition, if perfected, becomes a key, a rhythm so precise, it unlocks something waiting be. We are left then, with the same dread that has haunted every scholar of the Callaways since the first fragment surfaced. This is not a closed history, it is not finished. We, in reading, extend it. In repeating, we participate. And if the family's lesson holds true, then every act of doubling, every mirrored gesture, every duplicated word, brings us closer to the threshold they once approached. Perhaps, when you finish this account, you will hear it. 2 knocks against your wall, not 1, not 3, always 2. Do not answer, do not repeat, do not look into the mirror too long, for the Callaway pattern has already begun.